Hello and welcome to the first episode of Mind Over Meta, a series dedicated to exploring the deeper strategies that top players rely on to consistently succeed in Pokémon GO PvP. Throughout this series, we'll uncover the core techniques and mental tactics that help players outplay their opponents and achieve success. In today's video, I'll be showcasing a team that I believe has strong potential in the Season 20 meta. This team consists of Ferrothorn, Clodsire, and Shadow Feraligatr. What makes this team stand out is Ferrothorn's unconventional moveset. Instead of the usual Thunder, I've opted for Flash Cannon, a surprising choice that brings a unique edge and can catch your opponent off guard with unexpected damage. To demonstrate just how effective this move can be, let's dive straight into some gameplay and see its true potential in action. As the match begins, we're up against a Shadow Drapion. My opponent quickly switches into Ariados, which I counter with Clodsire. This gives me a clear advantage, as Clodsire can easily absorb anything Ariados dishes out. They fire off a Trailblaze, increasing their attack but doing minimal damage to Clodsire. I charge up to the Stone Edge, which my opponent lets through, dealing massive damage to the Ariados, and they go for a lunge, decreasing my attack. However, I'm fine with this because I know I can just swap out to reset the debuff. I then farm up enough energy for my second Stone Edge and decide to go for a CMP. I do this to avoid my opponent from potentially catching and to secure the takedown on the Ariados. However, I decide to go for a complete undercharge, making sure I get at least one more Poison Sting before exiting this matchup. My opponent brings in Dewgong next, so I swap back into Ferrothorn to bait out the Drapion. This gives us our first showcase of Flash Cannon's raw power, dealing around 70% damage in this neutral matchup. This now puts them in range of a Power Whip, but not before they fire off a Crunch, which I'm content in letting go. I then build up to the Power Whip before firing it off immediately. My opponent respects it by shielding and then smartly overfarms just before I get to the next Power Whip. I'm happy to let it go, as Ferrothorn has done more than enough work this game. When they swap Dewgong back in, I overfarm to ensure better timing. Anticipating an Icy Wind bait, I make the right call and hold on to my shield. With energy stored, I switch to Clodsire to secure the final shield from my opponent by using a Stone Edge. Although Dewgong is gaining extra energy from farming me down, I keep in mind that I had excess energy on my Feraligatr to keep up with the constant pressure. After Clodsire is farmed down, I immediately throw Hydro Cannon with Feraligatr, predicting that my opponent will attempt another debuff. I could easily shield, knowing that it could be a drill run, but where's the fun in that? I decide to let it go, and make yet another call on the Icy Wind. My opponent can't be happy after that one. I throw my final Hydro Cannon, and my opponent concedes the match, ending with a nice 2-shield flex. In the next match, we have a favourable lead with Ferrothorn facing off against Dewgong. I build up to 5 Bullet Seeds before throwing a Power Whip to trigger CMP, but my opponent makes a smart play by catching it on their Clodsire. However, this puts Clodsire right in range of a Hydro Cannon after 8 Shadow Claws, which is exactly how much energy it takes for Clodsire to get to a threatening Earthquake on me. We take out the Clodsire, which puts us in an excellent position because we come out with energy and health to threaten whatever comes in next. They come back in with Dewgong and fire off energy at us. I'm comfortable letting the Drill Rod go through, knowing their fast moves won't pose much of a threat. I gather some extra energy before launching a Hydro Cannon, but my opponent swaps to Marowak in an attempt to snipe us. Fortunately, I managed to fire off one last Hydro Cannon, securing a shield. I immediately switch to Ferrothorn, overfarming to back-to-back Power Whips before making my move. They throw the Bone Club, stalling the clock and dealing chip damage to me, so I decide to shield. Just before I get to the second one, they fire off another one and I decide to let it go, knowing that it won't be lethal. The first Power Whip draws a shield, and my opponent makes another clever catch by using Dewgong to absorb the second one. Although it was a nice catch, my opponent still doesn't know what I have in the back. Unfortunately for them, Clodsire's bulk allows us to play with our food a bit. surviving long enough to be able to throw a last second earthquake to take the win. The favourable leads continue as we find ourselves up against a Shadow Feraligatr. My opponent builds up 7 Shadow Claws before attempting to catch a move with their Skarmory. I counter with my own Feraligatr. It seems this opponent hasn't kept up with recent changes, as Skarmory's nerfs to both Steel Wing and Sky Attack are evident. I shield the Sky Attack and overfarm before launching a Hydro Cannon to eliminate Skarmory. It's always extremely important to know how much you can overfarm to maximize energy efficiency. After taking down the Skarmory, my opponent comes back in with their Feraligatr, but because of my energy management, I'm able to fire off a Hydro Cannon after only one more Shadow Claw, putting them in a tough spot. After letting their move go through, I switch back to Ferrothorn, only for my opponent to concede the match. Clearly core broken by Ferrothorn. Tricky lead in the next match as we find ourselves up against a Malamar. I decide to fire off the Power Whip immediately to start putting some pressure onto my opponent. They let it go and I do one more Bullet Seed before swapping to my Clodsire to attempt to make a catch, but my opponent patiently waits and fires off a Foul Play at me. I comfortably tank the move and farm up energy to be able to prepare myself for what my opponent brings in next. They attempt to catch my Stone Edge on their Dunsparce, but I patiently wait and overfarm before firing off an Earthquake. They build up to the Drill Run and fire it off, but I know that Clodsire's bulk can easily tank this. My second Earthquake falls just short of taking them out, but I'm content in letting Clodsire go down and getting a Bullet Seed farm down to threaten the Malamar. Here I keep in mind that Malamar had energy prior to leaving the initial matchup and that I would not win CMP, so I go for a Bullet Seed sneak in and shield the superpower before launching the Power Whip. Interestingly enough, they decide to shield. However, after the first superpower debuff, I know that I can survive this second one, so I let it go and start spam tapping on my Feraligatr to exit the matchup. Thankfully for me, it turns out to be a Carbink, which means that with the right energy management, I should be in a winning position to close this game out. They shield my first Hydro Cannon, and I keep tapping to wait for them to throw their charge move at me. I safely shield and build up back-to-back Hydro Cannons before firing them both off immediately to avoid my opponent's switch clock from becoming available. After taking out the Carbink, I go back into Ferrothorn so that I can comfortably farm to the Power Whip and fire it off to take the nice win. Energy management really was key to winning this game. It's a good example of knowing your Pokemon's limits, finding your win conditions, and executing appropriately. The uncomfortable leads continue as we face an Ariados. My opponent launches a lunge on my 5th Bullet Seed, and instead of staying in after the debuff, I swap to Clodsire. Before they switch out, they land another lunge to lower my attack and bring their own Feraligatr. I'm in a tough spot as they fire off a Hydro Cannon, which I let through, knowing it won't quite KO me. Rather than opting for the heavier hitting Earthquake, I throw a Stone Edge, hoping to reach a second one and pressure their shields. I barely managed to fire off the second Stone Edge at 1 HP, forcing the shield. After Clodsire goes down, I bring Ferrothorn back in, sneaking in a Bullet Seed since I know I won't win CMP. I land one more Bullet Seed before launching a Power Whip to take out their Feraligatr. When they return to Ariados, I instantly swap to my own Feraligatr to start farming energy. I shield their lunge and build up a bit more energy before throwing a Hydro Cannon. My opponent, aware of the attack debuff, chooses not to shield, barely surviving the hit and swapping to a Shadow Steelix. I time the Hydro Cannon perfectly to avoid any sneak-ins, and they let it go through. I shield their Psychic Fangs, which drops my defense, making the game even more challenging with my team's low health. I closely monitor their HP and bravely farm down to gather enough energy for Ariados in the endgame. I fire off a Hydro Cannon, forcing their last shield, and immediately switch back into Ferrothorn to reset my debuff, aiming to throw a Power Whip. Unfortunately, they managed to strike just before I can do so. Now it's all down to Feraligatr. Can it survive long enough to reach the final Hydro Cannon? Yes, it clutches with 1 HP and a dream. An incredible victory that required precise plays to navigate through multiple bad situations. This gives us a nice 5-0, which showcased the importance of energy management, taking calculated risks and overcoming unfavourable leads. Speaking of unfavourable leads, we find ourselves up against an Alolan Marowak. I swap to Clodsire to start gaining energy, but not before my opponent throws a Bone Club at me, chipping and dipping to their Azumarill. I throw the Earthquake on the correct timing, and my opponent returns fire with an Ice Beam. I'm aware that Clodsire won't be able to flip this matchup, so I hold off on shielding. I'm barely able to survive to make it to the second Earthquake. This should put them in a range where I can gain some nice energy on Ferrothorn. I bring Ferrothorn back in to farm energy, but I pivot to Feraligatr in an attempt to pressure their backline. Unfortunately, it's a Wigglytuff, and with this alignment there's just no winning, so I go for the fastest top left on Earth. Whimsicott lead in the next match. Normally this matchup is not ideal for Ferrothorn, however, as you might expect, I'm going for the surprise play. They go for a Moonblast but don't land the debuff. I farm up 1 extra Bullet Seed over the Flash Cannon to avoid being too obvious, then fire it off. They let it through and we get the satisfying one-shot KO. Their next Pokemon is Skeledirge, so I switch into Clodsire, a great matchup as we have 2 solid counters for it. They then swap to a Water Gun Lantern, allowing me to comfortably throw an Earthquake, which they decide to shield. Thanks to Clodsire's bulk, I just managed to reach a second Earthquake, taking their final shield. I bring Ferrothorn back in, building up energy for a Power Whip, but I hold off, anticipating my opponent's attempt to catch the charge move. I then swap to Feraligatr, shielding a Disarming Voice and overfarming before taking down Skeledirge. Now all that's left is their Lantern, and I can safely let Feraligatr fall to a Thunderbolt, leaving Ferrothorn to close out this game. But they decide to top left. In our final showcase of this episode, we have an excellent lead as we find ourselves up against a Wigglytuff. My opponent immediately swaps into their Clodsire, and instead of switching into my Feraligatr, I choose to stay in and wait for them to burn some energy. I let the Earthquake land before swapping to Feraligatr. I shield their Earthquake to preserve my health, then overfarm before throwing a Hydro Cannon. Switch isn't necessary, but coming out of this matchup healthy can also be a great alternative. They barely survive, forcing me to throw on a CMP. And they shield to force me to do the same. I decide to invest both shields, leaving the matchup with health and energy. They bring back Wigglytuff, and I switch to Clodsire to draw out their final Pokemon, which turns out to be a Shadow Feraligatr. There's no need to bait here, as Ferrothorn is already loaded with energy, so I go straight for the Earthquake, which they shield. I survive their first Hydro Cannon and attempt to fire off a second Earthquake, but my opponent times their CMP perfectly. This is where Ferrothorn shines. With the energy it banked earlier, we immediately fire off a Power Whip to KO the Feraligatr. And I'm sure you can guess the fate of this poor Wigglytuff as I farm up 2 more bullet seeds and fire off the flash cannon, ending the video with a bang. Thank you for watching the first episode of Mind Over Meta. Your feedback is really important to me, especially as this is my first video in the series. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the team and any suggestions for future content. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more PvP strategies coming your way. See you in the next one.